at the Ayn Rand Center, UK. I'm speaking today from beautiful Jackson Hole, where the summer weather's finally arrived and the magic of this place is upon us. Now, on this day, June 24th, 1509, Henry VIII was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Henry presided over a period of major price inflation that lasted most of his reign. And was that his fault? I have no idea. That's a story for another day. But I thought I would mention that to all you folks from the UK. Inflation is not a new phenomenon. Okay, I want to mention up front, so I don't forget, excuse me, that I will not be presenting next Friday due to a board meeting that I have to attend. But I will be back on July 8th with an interview with the economist Brian Simpson, talking about his new book, Declaration and Constitution, in which he critiques and rewrites important elements of our founding documents from a rational free market perspective. And that'll be a slight diversion from my normal subject of modern money creation and its consequences. But in that interview, we'll try to address the founder's intent regarding money creation. So I hope you can join us then. Bear with me, I still got a little frog in the throat here. So, but today I have a somewhat eclectic set of topics. So the order of the day today is going to be, first, a few little known but interesting contemporary economic facts that I ran across during my weekly reading, and things that I think are worth sharing. And in that department, I'm going to mention, excuse me, the Fed's unusual method of communication, and then a couple of interesting articles from the Wall Street Journal on the recent failure of economic experts. Then next, I want to address some very good questions that I got from readers after last week's discussion, which was on why price increases showed up in assets long before they showed up in consumer prices. Those questions were so good that I thought it was important to share them with you all. And then finally, those questions and discussion is going to lead us right into the main thought question of the day, which is, what is stagflation? And what does it mean, if it means anything at all? So, all right, so let's warm up with some of the interesting things that I read this week. One of the great things about studying money creation and its consequences is that the consequences of money creation are everywhere you look. It reminds me a little bit of energy production and energy policy, because just like energy policy, monetary policy affects every single economic decision you make every day, although monetary policy's effects are not quite as obvious as the effects of energy policy. So, but first, let's talk about the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Fed, the greatest money creator in all of history. Fed Chair Powell has said that he has three methods to implement monetary policy, three methods, three techniques. And you already know about two of them: the regulation of interest rates directly and the influence of monetary quantity, the quantity of money through open market operations. But maybe you did not know about the third method of implementing monetary policy called forward guidance, in which the Fed communicates its intentions to the world through the media. And in this forum, we talk a lot about the first two, but today let's look at this so-called third tool of monetary policy, forward guidance. Now, whoops, where's my mouse? Get going here. There we go. Have you ever heard the name Nick Timiraeus? I didn't think so. Most of you probably not. That's this guy. Nick is a veteran economics writer for the Wall Street Journal, and he's pretty good. Now, it turns out Nick is the primary conduit for Fed leaks about their policies and policy changes. When the Fed wants to communicate a change in policy, someone at the Fed literally calls up Nick, and apparently only Nick, to communicate the latest changes. And I don't know if they speak to him in code or under conditions of confidentiality or what, but Nick is so well known for his tight connection to the Fed that he is sometimes called Chairman Nick. Now, just to see how this communication method can affect markets, take a look at this chart from Bianco Research, and I'll explain this chart. Commodities brokers trade a futures contract to guess what the Fed funds rate will be on a certain date. And based on the aggregation of all these futures contracts, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange calculates the estimated probability that the Fed's going to make an interest rate decision by a specific date, on a specific date. Okay. So as more traders concentrate their bets around a certain outcome, the probability of this outcome increases. So what we have in this chart is the probability of a Fed rate hike of 75 basis points, 0.75%, at the next 3 open market committee meetings. So you can see, for example, that the blue line on the bottom says that up until about June 12th, the probability that the Fed would raise short-term interest rates by 75 basis points was under 10%, because everyone thought they were going to raise it by 50 basis points. So now with that in mind, just for fun, see if you can spot the day on this graph when Nick Timiraeus tweeted that the Fed would likely raise rates by 75 basis points. Prior to that day, the Fed funds market was pricing in less than a 10% chance. But as soon as the Fed leaked to Nick that they were considering a 75 basis point hike, Nick tweeted his new opinion out, and the probability in the Fed funds market went right to 100%. That happened within a day. So leaking information to Nick is one major way the Fed communicates with the public. And I just find it fascinating that they do it through a designated but unofficial mouthpiece in this way. All right, so that's a little inside baseball on how the Fed communicates. Next is something interesting. I came across this, something else interesting. It was in the Wall Street Journal, and it's in the category of expert opinion. Now, in general, I have respect for many recognized experts, but I also know that designated experts can be very, very wrong, especially in the field of economics. And I also know that they can be highly partisan politically. And if you don't understand that when you read them, you risk absorbing lots of bogus information or just plain noise. So case in point was a pair of recent articles in the Wall Street Journal. The first one was here on the editorial page, June 1st. Now, this article names 17 winners of the Nobel Prize in economics who endorsed President Biden's economic plan called Build Back Better. And here they are. You might recognize some of those names. George Akerlof, for example, is Janet Yellen's husband. Robert Shiller, famous housing economist. William Sharpe, famous financial economist. Danny Kahneman, famous behavioral economist, et cetera. Anyway, these folks here are criticized in the editorial for signing a letter that claimed that Biden's Build Back Better plan would actually be good for inflation. And the White House used their signatures in this letter as sort of a club, sort of an appeal to authority, constantly in speeches to sell his plan. And here's what they said. Here's a quote from the letter. Quote, because this agenda invests in long-term economic capacity and will enhance the ability of more Americans to participate productively in the economy, it will ease longer-term inflationary pressures. Now understand, this was a $5 trillion, that's with a T, trillion-dollar spending plan. And most of it was going to have to be funded with made-up, printed new money. Now, as the editorial writer pointed out, these economists ignored the role of excess money, forgetting economist Milton Friedman's famous lesson that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. As President Biden declared in an April 20 interview, quote, Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore. And that's at least one campaign promise Biden has kept. But anyway, since Build Back Better did not pass these economists can say the inflation prediction in their letter was never tested. But I think their inability to see in September of 2021, when this letter was written, that consumer prices were already rising fast. I think that makes their letter definitely a failure of expertise. And the failure of experts in general, including the economists at the Fed, really reminds me, the failure of them to see the risk of rising consumer prices reminds me of my favorite cartoon character here, Wile E. Coyote, who runs headlong over the cliff before he realizes that the consequences of not paying attention to where he's going or how fast he's going there is going to be disastrous. Now, what were all these smart people thinking, these smart economists? How could they claim that $5 trillion in spending would ease inflationary pressure when they know or had to know that this gigantic sum was going to be largely financed with new money? You would think that an honest or competent assessment from a career professional would at least acknowledge the risk of price increases. But, maybe these economists were misinformed, but I think more likely they are just partisan supporters of a government spending agenda, and they're not admitting it. Okay, let's go there. Okay. Now, this next article, the second article in the expert opinion department, is again from the Wall Street Journal. And this one is by a writer named Greg Ip, IP. He's a good journalist, and he criticizes the so-called output gap analysis model that most economists employ to explain production and inflation. The output gap method basically says that there's a potential production rate at which the economy can run. And as long as the economy is operating below its potential output, you can stimulate it, that is, keep injecting new money into it without causing price inflation. Using this framework, which has been around for many decades, the economics profession failed almost uniformly to anticipate the recent surge in consumer prices. Now, ironically, it was Larry Summers, a left-leaning economist, who was a notable exception to this opinion of the economics crowd. Summers warned that the huge monetary stimulus from the pandemic was very likely to cause a rapid CPI rise, and he was correct. You might recall from last week that I singled out Summers as someone behind a project to calculate the consumer price index based on the way it used to be done back in the 1980s. And using that consistent method, that puts today's consumer prices increases in double digits, an all-time high. So anyway, here are two examples, both from the Wall Street Journal, how designated experts, including mainstream economists and including the Fed and Nobel laureates, can get it wrong. Now, in my many years as an investor, I have learned time and time again to listen to the experts, but not to trust them. Call me a skeptic if you want to, but I would advise all of you to do the same. Trust but verify does not work here. Better to verify and then trust your own conclusions. Okay. Now with that, let's pause for a minute for any questions or comments before I delve into questions from readers from last week. Do we have anything to talk about, Daniel?
No questions so far.
Okay, good. Okay, now let's get to the readers' questions. And now to set the context for these questions, what we covered last week was basically the following points. First, when a commercial bank buys a bond, the bank creates new credit money to pay for it. That creates money. When the Fed buys a bond from a commercial bank, the Fed creates new bank reserves to pay for it. That's not typically called, that's not broad money. That's special money. 3, when the commercial bank and the Fed do these transactions simultaneously, that operation is called quantitative easing, and both new credit money and new bank reserves are created in equal amount. Okay. Now, an important point here is that only the bank's credit money, that's a bank deposit, M2, can be spent in the economy. So the Fed's action itself doesn't really create new money, but it does enable the banks to continually create money by creating a demand for their bond sales to the Fed. Okay, so with all that as backdrop, that's quick and dirty. Reader Duncan wrote, he said, thanks, Jim, and very informative. He goes, question one, after asset purchase by the Fed, the commercial bank sees a one-for-one increase in reserves and deposits. That's correct. Can the commercial bank then use those new reserves potentially to create 10 times new loans and new money? I.e., is there a multiplier effect due to minimum reserve requirements? And do commercial banks do this? All right. Now, the short answer to this question is yes, but there's a lot of nuance here. And here's the full answer. The Fed used to require that every U.S. bank had to carry a minimum amount of bank reserves as a fraction of its loans, a reserve requirement ratio. Now, the typical textbook example of the reserve requirement ratio is 10%, what Duncan used there. But in fact, the reserve requirement ratio was always much less than that. The way it was supposed to work was that if the bank reserves fell below the reserve requirement ratio, the bank would have to go to another commercial bank that had enough reserves and borrow some reserves to reach its regulatory minimum. However, here's the rub. In March of 2020, the Fed reduced the reserve requirement ratio to 0. And that new policy matches the 0 requirement reserve ratio of some other countries, notably the UK and Canada, that have not had reserve requirements in their banking system for many years. So the important point here is bank regulators, in our case, the Fed, could specify a minimum level of reserves to constrain loan formation. But in fact, this has not been done for many years. And instead, central banks, including the Fed, have always supplied the banks with enough reserves to meet cash withdrawals as the commercial banks grow their loans and their deposits. So the fact is, loan growth has determined reserves and not the other way around. So the loss of commercial bank reserves, if the bank loses reserves, does not affect really the bank's ability to create new money because reserves are not a restraint on money creation. Reserve levels theoretically could be a constraint if the Fed were to reinstate its reserve requirements. Also remember that some good quantity of reserves are needed to prevent a run on the bank. Reserves can be converted to currency on demand to meet withdrawals. So banks always like to keep enough reserves on hand to avoid a run. So they may determine that they need lots of reserves. But the reserve requirement is not a condition for creating a loan. Now, for reference on this, the Bank of England article that I cited last week explains that reserves are not a constraint. That's called Money Creation in the Modern Economy. And what it points out is that the major constraints on loan formation at the bank level are market factors for, mostly profit and loss, because the bank has to make a profit or it can go bankrupt. And then regulatory factors, such as risk assessments that are imposed on the banks by regulators. Okay, so if you're interested, please read that article. It's very straightforward. Okay, Duncan has another question. What happens when the government debt held by the Fed, matures, is repaid? Does the process work in reverse? Does the commercial bank see a one-to-one decrease in reserves and assets? Okay, the answer is no, and it gets a little technical, but I'm going to go through it. After the Fed buys the government bond from the commercial bank, it's the Treasury that has the obligation to the Fed. The Treasury owes interest and principal to the Fed. And at that point, the commercial bank is no longer involved in the Treasury transaction. Now, it turns out that the Treasury, and we've never talked about this before, the Treasury has its own account with the Fed and holds its deposits in the form of reserves, not bank reserves, because the Treasury is not a bank. Remember now, reserves are special money for interbank usage, but the Treasury holds its deposits in the form of reserves with the Fed. Okay. When we pay our taxes to the Treasury, commercial bank deposits actually decline. And so money as defined by the Fed, M2, goes out of existence temporarily. Commercial bank deposits decline when you send your money to the Treasury. And reserves held by the Treasury increase. So commercial bank deposits decline, commercial bank reserves decline, and those reserves go to the Treasury. The Fed's reserves, the Fed's liabilities are the same. They stay the same. They just shift from being owed to the commercial bank to now being owed to the Treasury. So then when the Treasury spends their money in the economy, they usually don't hold their reserve positions very long. The Treasury sends checks to its recipients, like a Social Security recipient, which is deposited in a bank. And then the reserve asset goes back to the bank in the same amount as the deposit goes up in the bank's liability ledger, and therefore money is reinstated, or I guess you could say recreated. So the act of Treasury spending money actually increases commercial bank assets in the form of bank reserves and commercial bank liabilities in the form of deposits, but does not change the Fed's liabilities, which simply shifted back from the Treasury to the commercial bank. So now to answer Duncan's question, what happens when Treasury debt matures and is paid off? When the Treasury pays off a bond owned by the Fed, the Treasury, which holds its money at the Fed, reduces its deposits to extinguish its debt to the Fed, and the Fed asset, the Treasury, also disappears. So the Fed asset disappears and the Treasury's deposit disappears. Okay. So if that was confusing, I'm going to include this explanation in the transcript of this broadcast so you can go back and read it and think about it. Now, by the way, Duncan's question raises an interesting point about the definition of money supply. M2, or spendable money, which is usually considered a measure of the broad money supply, does not include the Treasury's deposits at the Fed. Those are held as reserves, even though the Treasury can and does spend that money eventually in the economy. And that's why some measures of money supply, like the so-called Austrian money supply, include these Treasury balances when calculating the money stock. Now, I happen to agree with this AMS Austrian money supply definition on that point. Okay. And then finally, Duncan corrected me regarding my claim that commercial banks were responsible for student loans. He pointed out to me that this used to be true, but it's no longer true. Today, 92% of student loans are now direct federal loans, meaning the money comes from taxpayers. It's not newly created money. Duncan says, quote, private banks were crowded out of the student loan market 12 years ago, and clearly they're to blame for the explosion in education costs and student debt. In other words, that the blame for the explosion in education costs and student debt rests solely on the federal government, and I agree. All right, well, Duncan, thank you for setting me straight. My information was clearly out of date. I will say that, as Duncan points out, the student loans funded by taxpayers are still the cause of higher tuition costs but it's just that they're not funded by the creation of new money. So thanks, Duncan, for those questions and the correction. All right. Next, Anders wrote the following. This is interesting. I've always thought that in a capitalist economy without government involvement in money creation and hence no inflation, aggregate prices on goods and services would always trend down due to productivity increases, new inventions, etc. All else equal, this would mean that our money would go further year by year. We've seen some of this in the freest sector of the economy, information technology, where value creation has been immense over the past 40 years. Hypothetically, if this downward trend in aggregate prices would be minus 5% per year across all sectors, couldn't one argue that the Fed's arbitrary 2% inflation goal means that goods and services have seen a 7% annual inflation rate in the past couple of decades? So in other words, that minus 5 minus or 2 minus 5 is 7. Okay. So Anders, I would say, yes, you have, I think, approached this question correctly. As you say, the normal course of economic progress under capitalism is to increase production in part through technological progress, which drives down the nominal prices because the supply of goods and services is increasing in proportion to the demand. And you are probably aware that another time of great productivity increase, the late 19th century, prices in the USA trended downward for decades. And this was at a time of progress, prosperity, and declining nominal prices under a gold standard. But at any rate, Anders is right. The alleged trade-off between growth and prices, the notion that economic growth must entail higher prices, is not right. So I agree with Anders that the normal course of capitalism is rising real production and falling prices. But I would say, be careful calling price increases inflation. I know this is hard to avoid in common usage in daily conversation, and sometimes you just cannot avoid it because practically everyone equates inflation with price increases. But I think every time you do this, you risk creating confusion in your own mind. So in Anders' example, he says, quote, hypothetically, if this downward trend in aggregate prices would be minus 5% per year across all sectors, couldn't one argue that the Fed's arbitrary 2% inflation goal means that goods and services have seen the 7% annual inflation rate, et cetera? And my quibble here, it's a quibble, is better to say what you've really seen here is a 7% real price increase over that time period, meaning prices were 7% higher than they might have been with no monetary expansion. When you talk about inflation and then put a percentage to it, you're almost always equating inflation with price increases. So you have to be careful, okay? All right, now finally, here's a interesting two-part question from Andrew. And so here's Andrew's first question. Quote, I just listened to your YouTube video of the explanation for where the inflation was during all those years of quantitative easing. It makes a lot of sense. Glad to hear that from Andrew. Including your explanation of the beneficial effects on consumer prices of the increasing productivity due to improved technology, business methods, and globalization. I look forward to hearing, this is really his first question, I look forward to hearing your explanation of why we are now seeing consumer price increases when we had not seen them earlier. Okay, well, I am not going to try to fully answer today why we are just now seeing big consumer price increases, except to make some general comments. Remember the cigar store parable, okay? If the cigar store sells the same number of cigars each week, but the amount of money spent on cigars goes up, increases, then the average price of cigars must go up. And not only must their average price go up, that's the only reason the price can go up, as long as the quantity of cigars sold did not decrease. The price can only go up if more money is spent on cigars. So regarding the US economy, we know that after the initial reaction to the lockdowns, the quantity of consumer goods initially declined, but then continued to rise. And therefore, the CPI price increases we have seen must be caused by more money being spent, not by a shortage of goods. Okay, now, first of all, here's the famous chart I show practically every week of the mountain of money supply increase that entered the economy during the pandemic. Now, next, here's a picture of GDP from over the same time period, the last 10 years. The top line, the green line, is nominal GDP, and the bottom line, the blue line, is real GDP, or gross domestic product corrected for consumer price increases. Real GDP is an indirect measure of the quantity of goods, and it's in GDP, it's mostly consumer goods sold during the previous year. Now, it's clear from the real GDP line, the lower line, the blue line, that the real quantity of goods and services sold increased during the period in question. So this period of big inflation. So we know the quantity of goods sold, the supply of goods did not go down. So we can also see that there was an increase in the dollar spent. That's the top line, the nominal GDP line. The dollar spent went way up. So we know from this data, assuming it's reasonably accurate, that consumers spent more money during this period when prices were rising fast, and that the supply of goods didn't decline. So to me, it's clear that it was more money, not less goods. This is the cigar store that caused consumer prices to rise. Now, to really get to Andrew's question, though, the question is, where did that additional demand, that additional spending, that additional money come from? Could it have been from unused cash balances? I say no. I don't think consumers have that much money in their bank accounts or lying under their mattresses. So anyway, this is the question we have to answer. Where did the additional money come from? And now I'm going to give you a short answer. The short answer is that it came from a combination of government policies and programs funded mostly by the Fed and partly by the commercial banks. It was a combination of, number one, direct Fed lending, something the Fed actually does, but that we have never talked about before. The Fed actually does some, and it rarely does it, but it did in this case, direct lending to various businesses and entities, directly from the Fed, not from the banks. Second, it was from commercial bank lending guaranteed by the Treasury. And third, it was from direct transfer payments from the government, decreed legislatively, but then ultimately funded by the Fed through QE. So beyond that, I'm going to defer the detailed answer, as it would take a good bit of research to account for every dollar, but I'll do it if I can. Okay. Anyway, Andrew also goes on. He says, I wonder also if we are now seeing a fall off in productivity as the benefits of the deregulation that happened in the 80s have been replaced by increased regulation, and as globalization is turning back into nationalism. What do you think? March in a piece called Monetary Cancel Culture, and you can check it out on Substack. I do think the trend is and will be to reshore some industries to the USA that were being done more cheaply in other countries. And there may be there will be a negative cost and negative productivity factor to that. But it would be easy to overpredict on this, because I think globalization is not dying, but I do think it's maybe a little bit sick right now. And that may be due in part, as Andrew says, to a rise in a nationalistic tendency and, some restrictive. And it's interesting, both Trump and Biden seem to be along this path. But there's also possibly a reasonable component to it. There's some defense industry U.S. defense industries that China is a big supplier to, like, for example, some key semiconductor type components. And that's a security risk. And that will probably need to be reshored. So, but now as to the regulatory factor, the regulatory state, I'm no expert on regulation, but Andrew's definitely right. Regulation definitely hinders production. And all we have to do is look at the arch example in the fossil fuel industry, perhaps the most basic industry of all, and the regulatory restrictions that have such knock-on effects to nearly everything we does. You know, CO2 regulation today is a huge problem all by itself. If that doesn't obviously restrict production and productivity, I mean, it's just not. I just think it's almost self-evident, right? Okay. Now, Andrew's question, I think, provides a pretty good segue to the last topic of today, which is the issue of stagflation. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're good. We're in good shape. All right, stagflation. Now, the term stagflation is one of those words known as a portmanteau. It's a word that combines the meanings of two other words into a single phrase, a single word. Stagflation was first coined in 1965, apparently, by this guy, Ian McLeod. And this is what appeared in the Glasgow Herald. Attacking government's economic policy last night in the House of Commons, Mr. Ian McLeod, West Enfield conservative, the opposition spokesman on Treasury and economic affairs, described the present situation in Britain as, quote, stagflation, stagnation and inflation together. That's November 18th, 1965. Now, I would just pause here. It seems like the Brits give us other famous, what are these called? Portmanteaus, like smog. That came out of Britain, you know, a combination of smoke and fog, and Brexit, the Britain exiting the EU. I think it's interesting so many come out of Britain. Anyway, but notice that stagflation, stated this way by Mr. McLeod, is stated as if it's kind of a weird situation, a combination of two phenomena that are not supposed to occur together. They're not supposed to happen at the same time. And that's because basic Keynesian economics says that stimulating consumers to spend will spur production. So you should get you should get economic growth right along with consumer price increases. But when you get both rising prices and declining or very slow economic growth, this is allegedly an anomaly, a freak occurrence, an exception. And that exception is called stagflation. So let's take a look again carefully at this GDP chart. The blue line, again, on the far right, the one on the bottom, if you look carefully, you can see that real GDP has actually declined slightly in the last reported month. And you probably also know that most investors and economists believe that if you get 2 quarters in a row of declining real GDP, then that is called a recession, an economic contraction, you know, a reduction in economic growth. So based on this chart and other evidence that I'm seeing, we might even have already entered a recession. And frankly, I suspect we are in a recession, but we're not going to know that for sure for several more months of data till they come in. It's really not important whether we are or not. But note today, we even have today full employment. We have full employment, which is supposed to indicate a roaring economy. We have an unemployment rate of only 3.6%. And yet real production is crawling along, not soaring, and real GDP is actually declined a little bit. When unemployment is that low, we should be growing fast. But not only are we not growing fast, we're possibly even declining. So to me, this situation plus the 8+% consumer price increases we have, That looks to me like stagflation, and it will probably get worse. So the question I want to address is stagflation, which is a decline in real growth combined with widespread price increases, is stagflation really not supposed to happen, as most economists contend? Or can we readily explain how it happens, and why it might be logical that it happened? And I say, the question is stagnation or stagflation a feature, or is it a bug of the government's program of monetary expansion? Well, my answer is obviously it's a feature. That means I think it's normal, it's expected, and that you should get it whenever you have significant inflation. Now, first remember that inflation is not just rising prices. It's an undue increase in the money stock caused by government. Rising prices are merely one of the results of inflation. And another less appreciated result, less appreciated because it's harder to see, whereas price rises are very visible. Another result of inflation is the distorted price signals and the resulting misallocation of capital that causes a slowdown in real production. Now, government money creation always involves giving the new money to someone that the government wants to give the money to. And those recipients of the inflation money are people or groups that could not attract private investment or earned capital in a competitive market. That's why government inflates, to give money to the preferred recipients, to give them an economic power that they could not have earned, that they cannot earn in a marketplace. So right there, it's easy to see that the free market regards these inflation recipients as non-productive. If they were productive, they would have received investment money in the market. The pandemic stimulus was a perfect example of this. New money was just handed out to citizens and businesses. Some of these recipients had already been prevented from working due to government lockdowns, which of course was a travesty. But the fact is, these new money recipients did nothing to earn it. That is, they produced nothing in exchange for the new money that they received. All money, all dollars are a claim on real wealth. Granting new claims on wealth in exchange for nothing, that's really what inflation is, always causes a transfer of wealth from the wealth generators to the non-wealth generators. The wealth generators lose some of their ability to create more wealth. And in this way, inflation weakens both the wealth generation process and therefore slows down the pace of economic activity. Here's the key point. Money printing gives claims on wealth, that is new dollars, to those who have not earned those claims. Thus, inflation diverts wealth, that is, it diverts real savings, out of the hands of the legitimate wealth producers and into the hands of those who do not produce. When wealth generators have less real savings to work with, they cannot generate wealth as fast as they previously could. So it's clear that inflation, which diverts wealth out of the hands of productive elements of the economy, has to cause real growth to slow down. If enough wealth is diverted away from the wealth generators, economic activity and real growth will contract. And that seems to be happening now. Okay. Now, note that this reduction in economic output caused by inflation is something quite different, and it's in addition to any slowdown in production caused by government regulation and intervention, the problem that Andrew raised. For example, government regulation restricts fossil fuel production, and less fossil fuel production means slower economic growth. And in a similar way, heavy taxation slows economic growth. But regulation and taxes are different from inflation in that their effect on production is much more obvious, whereas the effects of inflation on the economy are harder to observe directly. Now, I think the reason for this is that the diversion of wealth from producers to non-producers under inflation happens through the market pricing structure, which seems to be intact, but which is actually sending false signals to market participants unbeknownst to them. For example, inflation distorts market prices, making some ordinary people think they're rich. And this signals to them that they can purchase luxury travel or buy an extra house when they really cannot afford it. And, maybe they should be taking staycations or saving their money for a rainy day, which is surely coming. But they don't know this because they believe the prevailing prices they see. So in other words, inflation via this money illusion disguises their impending poverty. So to illustrate, here's an analogy to illustrate the difference between the value destruction caused by taxes and regulation versus the value destruction caused by inflation. So I thought of this analogy. I wonder what you think of it. Suppose I have a dairy farm. I have a dairy farm. I have some cows, and I have a big tank where I store the milk. If the government through regulation does not permit me to milk my cows, I will readily note the loss of my production. Or if the government seizes milk, some of my milk as a tax, that loss is also obvious. But if the government comes along in the middle of the night, siphons off some of my milk, and then tops off the tank with water so that the milk looks the same as it always looked. It looks the same as it looked the night before the theft. It might take me a lot longer to realize that while my tank of milk is still full, the quality of my milk, its life-sustaining value, has been severely diluted. Now, this is what stagflation is all about. Government monetary expansion over time always results in higher prices and stagnation, hence stagflation. And although, as I say, this is not immediately visible, as the pool of real wealth, as it's sometimes called, gets drained under a policy of inflation, the phenomenon of stagflation becomes real. The eventual slowdown in production or slower economic growth is caused by the inflation itself. Okay, so I want to recommend an article. Here's a reference to it. And I'm going to quote from this article a little bit. This is from Frank Shostak, and it's a good article on stagflation. Quote, "Trouble erupts when money is created out of thin air. Such money gives rise to consumption which is not backed by production. It leads to an exchange of nothing for something. For instance, a counterfeiter prints $20. Since he did not secure this money through the production of goods, the counterfeiter therefore has obtained the $20 by exchanging nothing for it. The counterfeiter uses the newly generated money to buy 10 loaves of bread, which actually diverts real wealth, 10 loaves of bread, from a potato farmer toward the counterfeiter. Note that the diversion takes place by the counterfeiter, paying a higher price for the bread. He pays $2 per loaf. Previously, the price stood at $1 per loaf, and therefore pricing the potato farmer out of the market. Also note that since the counterfeiter does not produce anything useful, he is engaged in non-productive consumption and has obtained his consumption goods via wealth transfers from productive people. The potato farmer is now denied the bread that he must have to sustain him while he produces potatoes. Obviously, this will impair the production of potatoes, as fewer potatoes will become available, which in turn undermines the baker's consumption. This in turn impairs his ability to produce. We can thus see that while productive consumption sustains wealth generators and promotes the expansion of wealth, non-productive consumption leads to economic impoverishment. Printing money by the central bank produces the same damaging effect as does counterfeit money. The undue expansion of money sets the platform for non-productive consumption, which is an agent of economic destruction. Now, I recommend the entire article to you, and I recommend Frank Shostak also as a good reference on sound economics. Now, he writes for himself. He also writes, you can find his stuff with the Ludwig von Mises Institute. In my opinion, the von Mises Institute's a bit of a mixed bag. There are some very solid economists there. So if you are selective, you can learn a lot. All right. So in conclusion, let's start to draw a line here. Stagnation or arrested economic growth is a feature and not a bug of excessive money creation. And widespread price increases are also a feature, not a bug of excess money creation. So we have to conclude that stagflation, which is both the combination of both arrested growth and price increases, is really a necessary outcome, therefore a feature of an inflationary policy. All right, let us draw a line there. How are we doing on time? Oh, it's perfect. And let's see if we have any questions, comments, objections, or complaints.
We have Bonnie, who is a member, has a comment. She says she's wondering if you were a college professor, because you would have been great.
Oh my gosh. You know, I will tell you briefly. Back when I was finishing my commitment to the Air Force, I considered it. And two things drove me. First, I was not happy with the prospect of what I would need to study. The PhD programs I checked out were all highly mathematical. I'm pro mathematics. Don't get me wrong. I'm pro mathematics. But I had been reading von Mises for years, and I was convinced that a heavy mathematical approach would be a distraction from what I wanted to learn. And that's all I could find. I wish the George Mason approach I'd been aware of it at the time, because I know some PhDs who got their training there and they came out very good. But the second reason I decided against it was, frankly, I wanted to make some money, and I wanted to try to put what I knew into a financial advice and financial, or I guess a money management practice, which I did then for many years. And it turned out to be a good thing for me. So I have no regrets, but about it, even though a PhD would be a nice credential to have, but at my age, it ain't happening. But thank you, Bonnie, for that. I appreciate it. I am glad you find this informative, and it really makes me happy that that apparently it's coming through as clear to you. So thank you.
We also have a super chat from Duncan. He says, "Thanks for the explanations, Jim. Very much appreciated." And
I want a special thanks to Duncan. That is really valuable. Duncan asked these really cool questions. He's obviously got some knowledge, about this whole milieu, and it is very, very interesting to engage, and I think enlightening and educational for all of us when we get this kind of interchange and feedback. It also keeps me from making mistakes, which apparently I did, and thank you, Duncan, again for correcting that mistake.
And we also have a super chat from Bonnie, so thank you, Bonnie.
All right. Okay, so is that it?
Yes, that's all.
Okay, Daniel, enjoy the conference where you're at. I'm going to be at OCON and a board meeting next week, but I'll see you with Brian Simpson on July 8th. Thanks, everybody, and take care.